Well, good morning to those of you in the United States. Good afternoon to our audience in Europe and the Middle East, and a very warm good evening to those of you in Asia, particularly our viewers in India. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment. I want first to apologize for the technical difficulties that pushed the program for an hour. We appreciate you staying with us. So thanks to all of you. But second and more important, I'm delighted to welcome you to this, which is the second in a series of events that we're doing on the United States as a new administration takes office against the backdrop of an Asia that, to be very frank about it, has changed dramatically in recent decades. Now, in the first event in this series, which you can see on the Carnegie website if you missed it, I was joined by an all-star panel from the United States and Singapore and India, and we talked about the scope and nature of change in this part of the world through several disruptive breakpoints, but particularly since the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and 98. And today I'm delighted to be joined by another all-star panel for a discussion that will be a bit less general. We're going to zero in on the United States and India in this part of the world, but nonetheless, an all-star cast as well. Now, they're all well known to you, so I'm not going to dwell on their bios, but I'll just briefly introduce them. It's a privilege to have with us Suhasini Haidar, the National Affairs and Diplomatic Affairs editor of The Hindu, and one of the most careful observers, in my view, of India and of the United States-India relationship. We have my old friend Shyam Saran, the former Foreign Secretary of India, a many-time ambassador and truly one of the greatest Indian diplomats of his generation. And then my colleague and old friend Ashley Tellis at Carnegie, the Tata Chair and a trenchant observer of both India and the United States. Now, let me just take a minute and frame this, because we're going to talk about the U.S. India partnership, but in the context of structural, economic, institutional, and strategic change in this part of the world. Now, all four of us on the panel have done a lot of work on the U.S.-India relationship over the years. And so it's striking, guys, to me at least, as we swing into 2021 and come out of the first Quad summit and the visit to Delhi by the new American Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, that the ambition has grown exponentially, particularly in my view, on the American side, for what the partnership can do, particularly geographically in Asia. And let's be frank about it, against the backdrop of the rise of Chinese power in the region and globally. But to goose our discussion and maybe broaden it a little bit, I want to just put three, let's call them bald-faced propositions on the table for you. And you can react to these or not as we get into the discussion, but they're designed to provoke you a little bit. So first proposition, over the last few decades, I would argue that the region that we used to call the Asia Pacific has become more Asian and less Pacific. And that in turn has some big implications for the role of the United States in the region. And I'll put that a little more bluntly for you. On every metric, except related to security, America's role in this part of the world is growing in absolute terms, but declining in relative terms. So Asian economies are not just producers and exporters, they are consumers and importers, including from one another. They're not just capital recipients, they're capital providers, including to one another. And so not surprisingly, Asian countries and Asian companies, including but not limited to India, are concluding trade pacts, investment deals, forging ad hoc regional partnerships and so on. But interestingly, often without the United States in the room or as party to the agreements. That's the first proposition. Second proposition, if indeed, as I asserted, the region's becoming more Asian and less Pacific in some important ways, particularly economic, then one solution, which you've seen in both Delhi and Washington, is to enlarge our conception of the strategic and economic geography with the concept of an Indo-Pacific that moves us west to Madagascar, Seychelles, Mauritius, all the way across the Indian Ocean, and then to broaden our conception of the Pacific. So essentially to bracket Asia by extending our regional geography both west and east. And so in recent years, that's partly how American strategists and policymakers, I would argue, have adapted to the change. And to tip my hand, I like that conception. I like that conception of Indo-Pacific. But again, once we get outside the realm of security, and particularly when we drill down on economic standards for trade or for investment, for example, we find that regional economic standards are now being set by two agreements, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that do not include either India or the United States. And so for all of our talk about an Indo-Pacific, in the economic realm, at least, the largest economy in the Indo and the largest economy across the Pacific are on the outside of key regional pacts, and they're looking. So again, a more Asian and less Pacific, and in this instance, less Indo-oriented Asia as well. All right, last proposition, and then I want to dig into it. It seems to me that Indian foreign policy itself is in transition, and a big part of that, clearly, is the active improvement of India's relationships in Asia itself, particularly with pathfinder countries like Japan, like Singapore, like Vietnam, like Indonesia. And that's happening independently of what's happening with the United States. And economically, we find that while capital does flow to India from the United States, the largest infrastructure investor in India, for example, is who? It's Japan, an Asian country. The largest source of equity flows to India in the last calendar year was who? It was Singapore, again, another Asian country, followed closely by a couple of tax havens, Mauritius and the Netherlands. So to me, this begs the question, and this is what I wanted to do in the framing. How should the United States and India think about their partnership, not just against the backdrop of the rise of Chinese power, but together or in tandem in this dynamic and, it seems to me, increasingly Asian Asia, where sometimes they find themselves jointly on the outside looking in, but where their interests also are increasingly in some ways at tandem. And so the best place to start, I thought, would be to talk a little bit about the dynamic in Delhi, and particularly how India as an Asian country finds itself situated in the region, and how it's thinking about that outreach and development of partnerships with Asian countries in terms of its own strategy and sense of itself in the region. So Suhasini, I thought I'd start with you, and I'd ask you just to talk a little bit about that trajectory. And I'm not asking you to set China to the side, because you can't set China to the side. But the region is more than just the strategic rise of China, the economic rise of China. So give us a sense of how Indian foreign policy is dealing with that set of dynamics and the relationships, particularly with other key Asian countries in the region.
Sure, and thanks so much, Evan, for having me on with such a distinguished panel, including yourself. I can't believe it's a decade since you wrote that essay, Why America Still Doesn't Get Asia, because so much of what you wrote about was prophetic, and so much of what you wrote about remains true. So I do think it's necessary to challenge our assumptions, away from the headlines of the day, if you like. The truth is, yes, India has year upon year strengthened its ties or its focus, if you like, on its east. It has what is called an Act East policy, which used to be called a Look East policy. So it's become a little more proactive. There are several parts to it. One part is India's outreach to ASEAN countries, the ASEAN-India dialogue, which is really a cornerstone of this. And we've seen the second part really in terms of infrastructure heading out eastwards. So the connections of the northeast states of India with the east eventually is seen as really the future of so much of Indian trade and connectivity projects, roping Bangladesh in as well. And I think when you refer to Japanese investment in India, the truth is a lot of that investment is now going into these northeast projects. The Japanese ODA actually came out with a paper on the kind of projects it is now funding in India. Which would be starting even just a few years ago. So there's definitely a very proactive look over there. But the largest part of it, and what has really kept in the headlines, is India's Indo-Pacific strategy over the last few weeks, particularly after the Quad Summit. So I do want to start by saying, because I know that we'll get into a lot of the nitty-gritty a little later maybe, I do want to start by saying that that I think the kind of commentary we've seen in the past few weeks has somehow conflated India-US ties on one side with India's Indo-Pacific strategy and, in fact, with its Quad policy. And so I wanted to make the point that those two really are not exactly the same. India-US ties, and I'm sure we'll get around to discussing them, they're good. They're on an upward trajectory. They have been for 20 years. So 20 years later, they're definitely in a very good place. Growing trade, growing defense trade, dialogues on 35 odd issues. I mean, we can spell it out. But India's own Indo-Pacific policy, its look at the region, the maritime region to its east, is very different from this India-US dynamic. And I think that's somewhere where you see areas of convergence between India and the US, but also areas of divergence. The Quad, for example, is one of many platforms that India is seeking in its Indo-Pacific policy. Apart from the ASEAN-India dynamic, India is reaching out to the European Union, to the UK, specifically to Germany, France, even to Russia. Which should give you an idea of how broad-based India is making this, and this is all in the present government. ASEAN centrality is very much a part of this Indo-Pacific policy, but you're looking at a time when ASEAN countries themselves are not showing a deep level of comfort with any kind of arrangement that seeks to pit each one of them or make each one of them a kind of proxy in a US-China confrontation. And the more we hear of that confrontational language, particularly the kind that we saw there in Alaska, I find that the more silence you are hearing from Southeast Asian capitals when it comes to how they are going to deal with it, you're seeing more of them go inwards. And more regional, if you like. And you pointed out yourself that these two economic frameworks that they're all a part of have neither of the bookends of the Quad strategy. They don't have India and they don't have the United States in RCEP or in CPTPP. So we are looking at a very different way of engagement, particularly if you're looking at it from the Indian side. Of course, India is also, and you said, let's put China aside, but we can't do that. India is the only member of this arrangement, of the Quad arrangement, that actually has a land boundary with China. It is steeped in its geography in Asia and in its 3,500 kilometer boundary with China. And while the US has alliances with Japan and Australia, India does not. We heard External Affairs Minister Jaishankar say very clearly 6 months ago that India will not be part of an alliance structure, even in the wake, and this is why I bring it up, even in the wake of the 2020 standoff between Indian and Chinese troops, Chinese incursions, clear aggression at the line of actual control, India has not moved publicly from the idea that its ties with China remain a bilateral issue. It is seeking more and more assistance from the United States, as both Mr. Pompeo pointed out, as well as now we heard from the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin while he was here. But we are not seeing that go beyond those stated positions, while India remains a part of other arrangements in the region, like the BRICS, like the SCO, and the rest. So I would say India's policy in this region has not yet moved. Maybe what we're looking at is a very large ship, and I don't mean the Ever Given, which is slowly making a turn. But we haven't quite seen the first bit where you can say, okay, now this is a course that India has set on in terms of seeing its East through the prism of its relationship with the US very clearly.
So, Shyam, can I pick up on that last sentence? India seeing its interest in Asia through the prism of its relationship with the United States. That's partly what I'm trying to get at, is how does the United States factor into India's own thinking about its role in the region, particularly given the dynamism in the region? And I mean, you've observed, I mean, you've been an ambassador all over the region. You've been doing this for a long time. And it's not new for the United States and India to talk about their common or complementary interests in this part of the world. I mean, back in the midst of time when you and Ashley and I used to sit around in the State Department or in South Park, we were having Asia-related dialogues. But I wonder whether you think the India in the region that President Biden finds now in 2021 is the same one that he left behind in 2017. In other words, is the way India conceives of its interests or of the challenge of it's facing, but also of the way that it can leverage partnerships in the region to serve those interests, not just with the United States, but with Asia. How is that changing? How should the Americans think about that and understand that?
Thank you very much, Evan, and it's great to be back with at least three members of the team that had a lot to do with one another in the years where we were trying to construct a much more substantial relationship between India and the US. With Suhasini watching and with bated breath waiting for what is the new line which is going to come out. So it's great to be back again. Let me say this, that as someone who was associated with the very landmark sort of initiatives which were being taken in the years from 2003 to, I would say, even up to 2008, when we concluded the U.S. nuclear deal. If I look back at what our expectations were from the India-US partnership at that time, and the road that we have actually traveled from then to the present time, I would certainly say that the relationship has gone beyond what would have been my very optimistic expectations. So that's the first point I would make, that if we are looking at a slightly longer term perspective, frankly speaking, the relationship has gone beyond what many of us, I don't know about you, but certainly I think on the Indian side, we would not have expected the relationship to go this far. If you just take the defense, hardware relationship, not just the military exercises, but the hardware relationship is worth something like $20 billion. And when I look at the kind of, reservations that there were, should we really be getting into a defense hardware relationship with a country which has not been reliable in the past? Are they really going to pull the rug under our feet again, like they have done in the past? Really, it is quite remarkable what has happened. Let me also just give you one anecdote. The first meeting that I had on the foreign secretary, undersecretary level, when we started exchanging views about regional issue, I'm talking about 2004. And when I raised the issue of Pakistan, my American counterpart said, well, that is something that must be kept aside. We will not go in that direction because, that is a sensitive relationship. You can say what you want, but we are not going to say very much. Now, if you compare what we are doing today with respect to our respective relationship with Pakistan, there is a sea change. So, first point that I would like to make is that really, in terms of what we are looking at in the future, it is worthwhile perhaps to look at how far we have traveled in the past. That is the first point I would like to make. Second point that I would like to make is that my view has been that while the US has been very much focused on the eastern flank of India, and the Indo-Pacific, as far as the US is concerned, has been from Bollywood to Hollywood. That is the area that we are looking at. And in terms of maritime security, also we have been focused on that. In terms of some part of the China challenge, we have also been focused on that. But, I have always stated, for a decision maker sitting in Delhi, if he is looking at India's security challenges, he cannot look only to the east. he has to look to the West. And even if we are talking about China, China's threat to India or challenge to India is not only being seen on India's, eastern flank, it is very much, perhaps even more so, on the western flank. Particularly given, for example, the relationship between China and Pakistan. Now, this has always been a problem in the past, that the US has been very much focused on PACOM, but on CENTCOM, going further in the Western direction, it has been somewhat more reserved in terms of, really working together with India. And I would say, quite frankly, that so has India been. If you take, for example, India's relationship with Iran, or the reservations India has about what the US may have been doing in Afghanistan. So there has been an issue there. But there, I would say, for the future, what I was struck by is the fact that we seem to have overcome some of the reservations of working together with CENTCOM. If I'm not mistaken, there is an Indian liaison now in CENTCOM. And importantly, when the new defense secretary was in Delhi recently, started talking about, the Africa command of the US, where India should be working together. Now, if this is signs of perhaps broadening the strategic partnership and also including theaters which are also important to India, I think that could be a significant step forward. That is the second point I would like. Third point I would like to make is what has been stated about the two very important trading arrangements. I think it is the RCEP and the CCTPP. Okay, where neither India nor the US are there. Now, this I think is the weak link. And also the weak link is that despite the tremendous potential that exists, to my mind, on the India-US trade and economic front, that is almost an adversarial relationship between the two countries and has been for quite some time. Mm. And if tomorrow the WTO is again revived and there are going to be negotiations there or discussions there, I am afraid that that adversarial kind of relationship will get sharpened again. Now, here my view has been that if we were able to resolve what was a much more sensitive, much more difficult legacy issue, the nuclear issue, with tremendous amount of energy put in on by both sides and not letting go, running into difficulties, running into almost impossible odds, but being able to get around them. Why can't we do this at least in an area which has actually greater promise in a sense? So I would say that the agenda for going for the future, the security aspect, I believe, is well consolidated and will go further. On the economic side, it is weak and it can trip us up in the future. And if we can at least begin the process of addressing that, I think there is much greater promise to the relationship. And I'll end by saying, I do not agree that India-US relationship is only about China. Certainly from the Indian perspective, the relationship with the US actually is very important for many other reasons. Most important being that India wants to actually achieve many of its economic objectives, developmental objectives. The relationship with the United States of America is indispensable in a sense. If we are looking at how to give India access to high technology, if growth today is technology driven, where is the intellectual capital of the world still? Yeah. Despite the relative decline of US that we are talking about, US still remains the knowledge capital of the world. So there are many other reasons why India and the US need to work together. And if we are not part of these two deals, let us be part of a bilateral deal between India and the US. Why not? Yeah, right. Thank you.
Ashley, can you pull that thread? So pull that thread a little bit. Realistically, So what can India expect of the United States in the Asian context? Not just in terms of the bilateral partnership, but in terms of where the United States can enable or be helpful to India's broader set of strategic and economic objectives in the Asian region and vice versa. What can the United States realistically expect of India in terms of pursuing its own objectives? Just drill down in a policy sense and talk about where you think that agenda needs to go. Especially because Shyam posited this bifurcation of security and economics. But if you listen to people you're sitting in Washington, everybody's talking about integrating security and economics. So how do we pursue that integrated approach in partnership if that bifurcation continues to exist? Talk a little bit about that.
So first, let me start by thanking you, Evan, for calling me to this conversation. And of course, delighted to see both Suhasini and Shyam, who are old friends. Let me start by making one important point, that I think India sees the US as still the pivotal power in Asia and beyond Asia, but it is not the sole power through which its relations with Asia must be mediated. And I think you have to do justice to both these polarities, that the US is still a pivotal power, but it is not the only power. And so India is trying to essentially navigate between these two polarities as it thinks about the region. Now, when India looks at the Asian order, right, it sees a stratification, I would say, along three lines. At the geopolitical level, it is very much about preserving a balance that limits China's capacity to harm Indian and other Asian interests. At the economic level, it is very much a story about integration and increasing Asian integration. But that integration is laced with fears that the integration will come to be increasingly dominated by China, and that would create problems both for Indian interests and the interests of its partners. And so a good deal about Indian policy is really trying to figure out how to gain the benefits of integration while minimizing the liabilities. And then, of course, the topmost layer of the stratification is essentially the values question, which India increasingly defines purely in democratic terms, or at least formally in democratic terms, rather than in wider terms relating to liberalism or pluralism or what have you. So let me sort of step back now and say, what is India trying to do here? I think what India is trying to do is keep the geopolitical foundations right. And to do that, I think they recognize that there is no alternative but to have a very robust relationship with the United States. Because where geopolitics are concerned, US and Indian relationships are very tightly convergent. Both want to have a free and open Asia, do not want to see an Asia dominated by China, et cetera, et cetera. The problem really, as we think going forward, is whether geopolitics will be sufficient for both sides to achieve their aims. And as I was thinking about this issue last night in sort of anticipation of the conversation this morning, it occurred to me that this is going to be a very interesting test case between realists, Marxists, and liberals. I mean, realists would make the argument that geopolitics drives everything. You get the geopolitics right, the rest is superstructure, and we don't have to worry too much about it. Marxists would make the argument that the geopolitics is actually the superstructure. The real questions are economic integration, economic fractures, so on and so forth. And the liberals would make the argument that, look, we need to get our value systems in sync. As long as we can create democratic solidarities throughout Asia, et cetera, all the rest will fall in place. So it's going to be interesting to see which of these two views, which of these three views actually, sort of turn out to be the most persuasive. From an Indian point of view, I think they see it almost as hierarchic, which is focus on the geopolitics, get the relationship with the United States, but not to the exclusion of other Asian relationships. So double down on the partnership with Japan, develop the relationship with Australia to the degree that that's possible, look at other Asian partners, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the top of that, look for ways in which you can integrate within the larger Asian space. Now, this is where the biggest problems arise, in my judgment. Because to do the kind of integration that would be successful from an Indian strategic point of view, there have to be some very hard choices made within India with respect to its own economic policies. And I see an India that is much more fearful and much more uncomfortable with the idea of external openness. And that, to my mind, actually imposes brakes on India's ability to integrate with the wider region in a way that would be productive, of course, for the United States, of course, very importantly productive for India, and also for other Indian partners.
Can I pull that thread? So here's what struck me. So when India made the decision to stay out of RCEP, and I don't want to relitigate that decision or ask you where you stand. What struck me about the conversation in India was, and I hate to say that, how defensive it was. A lot of the conversation was focused on defending what India already had, as opposed to trying to grow opportunities in new directions on what India could have. And in the meantime, as India elected to stay out, rules, norms, standards are getting baked in by other countries in this part of the world that are not standing still and waiting. And I say rules, norms, and standards because what struck me just in the last few weeks, I keep hearing about the rules-based order. Tony Blinken goes to Alaska, he talks about the rules-based order. We saw the leaders' statements at the Quad, free, open, in Prime Minister Modi's case, inclusive, but we also heard about rules-based order. So if this is really ultimately about who sets the rules and getting those rules locked in and then being participatory in both setting the rules and being part of the rules-based order, it does raise the question for me, how important is it for the United States and India jointly to participate in rule, norm, and standard setting? So we already talked about the trade space. Shyam, Suhasini, Ashley, you all noted that on the trade side, the US and India are both out. But there are other standards and rules that are being set in other areas that are beyond the scope of those agreements. But it strikes me that even there, India and the United States are either out or not collaborating. I'll give you an example. Cross-border data access and transfers. Prime Minister Abe, we talked about the India-Japan partnership. We've talked about the Quad, the US-Japan alliance. Prime Minister Abe had a cross-border data initiative called the Osaka Initiative in the G20. And guess who elected not to join it? India elected not to join it. And by the way, some of the other members of Team Free and Open, like Indonesia. So even beyond the trade space, rules are being solidified. And I don't see the United States and India acting in tandem, much less jointly. So to throw it back, maybe we start with Shyam, then we go around. How important do you think it is that the US and India jointly, but at minimum, separately, but in complementary ways, be participatory in these rules-based processes if they're going to purport to be the champions of rules-based order? Suhasini.
Well, absolutely. And it's not so much to say, a value judgment about how much they should be or shouldn't be. It is if they profess to want to be part of that rules-based order. And in a sense, India has great ambitions to set that rules-based order. Then they're going to find it very difficult if they don't join that rules-based order before trying to set those. In other words, when it came to the RCEP, the fact was not just that India decided to stay out at the end, but that decision came on the back of years of India actually being part of the RCEP negotiation on various chapters and deciding how the rules should be set. So, it just seemed like a huge contradiction there. You spoke about the data initiative, what was called the Osaka track, which India walked out of at the last minute. It wasn't as if it had not been part of it, but of course, we realized later that some of that decision was driven by the government's decision to bring in a new data localization law. That's been at the base of a lot of tensions between India and the US. It could be the base for more, not sanctions, but measures by the US against India. So we are looking at a place where when you talk about being part of the rules writing, you have to be willing to accept some kind of role inside the tent than outside of it. Today, everybody seems to be very okay with India's decision to stay out of the Belt and Road Initiative. And certainly the way the BRI has played out for so many countries, it doesn't. India seems to be at quite a pretty place, not having joined it. But the question is that eventually the rules-based order, even there, is going to be about building some kind of diplomatic fora by which you can say that here are the standards. Here are the standards by which countries should be allowed to give aid for infrastructure. Here are the standards for transparency. Here are the standards for sustainability, for environmental protections that should be necessary for those countries. Now, those dialogues cannot be had outside of a room. They cannot be had without the parties that are, in fact, the most egregious sort of violators of that rule-based order to somehow be engaged diplomatically. I know I'm running against the tide over here when I say that, but I do feel very much that we have to look at more inclusive ways of having these negotiations instead of running into our constant binaries where it's either in or out. It's not a constant place of diplomacy. So the short answer to your question is that trend of the last few years of the U.S. walking out of a number of agreements, the JCPOA, the Paris Accord, some of those are being reworked now, of course. But even things like UNESCO and WHO, India saying we will not be part of RCEP, walking out of the Osaka track, and others that you pointed out. These are not, shall I say, healthy symbols of how both countries are going to look at international diplomacy about setting this rules-based order on its own. And one thing I do want to point out in terms of staying out of the tent but not being in it, the US, and especially in the Quad as well, we've constantly heard about the rules-based order and UNCLOS, but the US itself has not ratified UNCLOS. It stays out of that system, and yet it keeps referring to it as the system that should be adhered to. So I think that these are areas where, each of us needs to sit down and discuss just how much we want to build the system and how much we want to use that system to get ourselves ahead.
Yeah. So, Shyam, what's the right vehicle for the United States and India to think of themselves as rule writers and standard setters, as opposed to takers and importers of those? Is it the Quad? Is it existing processes in Asia that they join? Is it the G20 content? Is it something else? What would be the right vehicle for that for them?
Well, all of it.
All of them.
I mean, why look at this or that? I think the first order of business is how much do the Indians and the Americans wish to work together for the setting of the rules. Merely saying rule-based order is not enough. You have to get into that exercise, and you have to make choices. So I think the setting of standards, setting of norms is taking place across the board today, mainly because technology is moving at such a rapid pace that you need to keep revising, need to keep updating, in fact, those rules of the game. We are talking about, say, the data transmission issue. It is going to become even more complex going forward. Or, cybersecurity, for example. So there are a whole set of areas which are actually crying out for some kind of global, governance. Most of these areas are completely, chaotic areas.
And do you feel like India? Do you feel India is sufficiently engaged in that at the present?
Well, I feel that in a number of cases, it is only through engagement with one another that you can actually get a sense of what is the nature and the scope of the challenge which you are facing. Let me be very clear. I mean, in today in India, in some of these areas, we are not fully aware of what is the nature of the challenge and the scope of the challenge that we are facing. Now, a constant conversation and engagement between India and the US could actually be very useful. Not always to begin with saying, we will have this conversation in order to bring up some rules. But even in terms of, just awareness of where we are, I think those conversations can be very, very important. So that's something that, in terms of the India-US relationship, there is one thing which I learned from the very intense kind of negotiations that we had, over the Indo-US nuclear deal and several other issues. That is, it is not necessary that you always agree upon what the course of action should be, but it's very important for each side to know where the other is coming from. Unless you have a conversation where we are actually talking to each other, not talking past each other, you are likely to go astray. And I think what worked during that particular period was that we were in a position to, or we were inclined to have that kind of conversation. I recall, for example, a lecture that I got from Steve Hadley on our relationship with Burma. But then I had to explain to him why India has the policy that it has with respect to Burma. And he may not have accepted what I was saying, but he at least understood why we were in the place where we are. So I think even on these issues, I think there is much to learn from that experience. So that is one point. The second is, as I said, I think in both countries, the importance of the economic pillar in any engagement, and is that I'm not just talking about India-US, but in general, if we are really looking at how do we ensure that we are a major player, a significant player in what is happening in this region, unless you are part and parcel of this and you recognize the importance of the economic and trade relationship, you will be pushed to the margins of the regional economy and the global economy. And you cannot play the kind of role you want from the margins of the regional and the global economy. Now, US is, of course, I'm not saying that the US is on the margins, but relatively speaking, it is, not as influential as it would have been in the past. There are other major players. We have to recognize that. In India, the situation is even more serious because I think, we are not really perhaps fully aware of what this is doing to us in terms of the other ambitions that we have. That is something which we need to perhaps look at. The sense that because we are a very large economy, and yes, that's still a dynamic economy, we have a huge market, that is not enough. That has to be, I think, understood. With respect to what Ashley talked about, the geopolitical part, the issue of, for example, values, all these are important. But currently, I would say that the geopolitical part is perhaps much more salient in the Indian calculation than perhaps the other aspects are. We may have a certain preference, but I think the reality is that is what drives much more today how we relate to the US or how we relate to the rest of the world than perhaps may have been the question in the past.
So, Ashley, I'm going to start to pull the audience into the conversation. We're getting some questions about the Quad and other things. So maybe that's a good kind of segue from you into some of the Quad questions. But so here's Myanmar, where fast forward to 2021, we have a coup, we have a mess in the country. I don't know, Shyam, what kind of lecture Steve gave you back in the day, but I'm suspecting Jake Sullivan may be giving a similar lecture this week to various players about Myanmar and about what the U.S. is hoping for, particularly on the sanctions front. That being the case, we hear a lot about ASEAN centrality, for instance, but ASEAN, of course, is in its own ways challenged in Myanmar and is in some ways absent. And ASEAN has its own issues, alphabetic rotating chairs, secretariat isn't always so strong, consensus as opposed to majority. So when people talk about the Quad, you often hear in the next sentence, yeah, but it threatens ASEAN centrality. But of course, there are challenges to bowing to ASEAN centrality as it was, given some of the structural and institutional impediments that ASEAN has itself. So I'm just wondering, as I segue into the questions about the Quad, what's the potential for the Quad to mesh up with some of the preferences that other players in Asia have around non-Quad related decision making? And particularly zero in on a problem like Myanmar, where both the Quad and and ASEAN have been found wanting in the eyes of some in terms of really driving toward a solution to a very acute, tragic, and gathering problem that's growing in scope and intensity by the day.
Well, let me answer the ASEAN question quickly, and then I want to address something that Shyam raised. On the ASEAN question, I see that as being a useful diplomatic forum that India values because it brings together a group of countries that are capable and do want to signal resistance to Chinese assertiveness and domination. So there is a diplomatic value to the Quad, which I think ensures that it will have longevity as long as current Chinese behaviors persist. And this is certainly a preference on the part of all the 4 members. So that itself assures itself a certain viability. But I don't think we should, again, think of the Quad as somehow being the nucleus of a new containment of China, because that is simply not going to be the mechanism for that purpose. I see the Quad as simply one more addition to Asia's sort of evolving architecture for dealing with the Chinese. To the degree that it goes beyond simple geopolitics, I think the Quad is a useful forum for mobilizing supplementary forms of work in the economic space, in terms of providing support for third parties, in terms of coordinating, in terms of economic diplomacy, and so on and so forth. But that's pretty much as far as I would go with respect to Quad viability, at least for the foreseeable future. I want to make one other point relating to what Shyam said and to the question that you asked earlier, which is, can the US and India really become sort of joint partners in rule right? And I think the answer to that, honestly, outside of the geopolitical space is no. In the geopolitical space, yes, our interests are deeply convergent and we can find ways of coordinating it, in ways that are really meaningful. When you go beyond the geopolitical space, you have to recognize that the US and India are positioned at very different levels on the economic ladder. And India is thinking of its economic development, unfortunately, in more defensive terms today than I would like. I mean, the model that animates a lot of Indian policymakers is the infant industry model. And given their experience in the bilateral trade with China, they're simply afraid of being overwhelmed by a premature openness to the global economy. And so there is a defensiveness in Indian external economic decision-making that is going to impede them from being partners with the United States in rulemaking. Now, when you add to this the challenges posed by rising Indian nationalism, right? The view that Indian data is somehow a national resource which has to be protected, cannot be shared, cannot be distributed elsewhere, et cetera, then it complicates the story about rulemaking even more. So on the fundamental question of what is the relationship between the state and markets, the US has a very different view from India. And given the huge differences in views between ourselves, I don't understand how we can be partners in rulemaking in any serious way in areas outside of geopolitics. And maybe that's all that's necessary for the moment, because as Shyam said, if India is taking its bearings from geopolitics because that's the central sort of foundation, then the question really for the United States is a very simple one. Do we have a comparable view which allows us then to work productively with India? Or is the geopolitics going to be subordinated to other interests like economics or like values, in which case then we are going to have, shall we say, a little more trouble than people anticipate in the bilateral relationship. But that is really the question that decisions have to be made about in Delhi. In Washington.
Shyam.
I would just like to say here that even in terms of the current orientation of India's, economic policy, there are actually big openings with this particular government in terms of, for example, foreign investment. Here is a prime minister who's willing to openly stand up and say, I want foreign capital to come in. So, it's not as if there is a blank wall. There are lots of crevices, here and there, which you can actually exploit, because there is also the sense that we need capital from outside. We need technology, and the US is a big source. So leverage that. Not say, oh, this particular government is only focused on geopolitics. I think that also is an opening, provided you see that as an opening and are willing to, work on that. Secondly, I would say that, we should not look at what's happening as kind of a slice of history. It is a very dynamic situation. So if you take even the Quad, the fact that you have moved from this being, just a secretary level meeting, joint secretary level meeting, to the ministers meeting, to actually having perhaps not expected to have a kind of a summit meeting, whatever may have been the driver, is an important development. So I would say that, we should allow for there being, on each side, there being sort of a more nuanced approach. Not necessarily look for, complete consistency in terms of how we approach each other. Yeah. But, there are, to me, it seems to me that there are, in fact, openings which both sides can actually leverage, provided because of the geopolitics, you realize that this is a very important relationship. And therefore, there is a willingness to also look at what may be other opportunities which are on offer. So I would say that perhaps a little more openness, even on those so-called difficult areas. I think it would be worthwhile, having a policy which is a little more flexible in that regard.
Can I use your point to Ashley about relative economic openness to investment and so on as a point of departure to pull in one of these audience questions? So this is Shuja Nawaz, who's asking about India's role in shaping the environment around trade, connectivity, mutual investment, particularly in the South Asian geography. So I think the core of that is really India-Pakistan. But how much can India be a driver of that? Not just with Pakistan, but regionally. What are the vehicles and how do you see the trajectory on that? And this is really, I guess, for Shyam and for Suhasini. And Shuja has an interesting prize here. He says, can there be a new grand?
I would say India is already really talking about trying to bring together the region, minus Pakistan right now, because of the obvious problems that have persisted between the two countries, although we are seeing some kind of a window between the two countries right now. And just today, Pakistan has partially reversed its trade ban for a few items from India after 2 years. So I'm not saying that's not possible. I'm just saying that right now, India is looking a little more modestly, if you like, in the region at areas like BIMSTEC, and areas like what it calls BBIN. But they haven't moved ahead as many would have thought they would. Even when it comes to something like the motor connectivity project, which was pushed because, Pakistan refused to be a part of it, so it had to be taken out of the SAARC region. India pushed for it, but even a country like Bhutan, which has so much of its trade, in fact, nearly all of its trade with India, stood its ground and said, sorry, we do not want to be a part of the motor connectivity. So there are a lot of these issues, but I think India is very much thinking in terms of road connectivity, port connectivity, intra-riverine connectivity. We're hearing a lot more about those things, as well as the new age of connectivity, electric sharing, power generation sharing, as well as, of course, broadband technology, a new line that actually went to Bangladesh but helped India's northeast as well. But I think a lot of these, and here I do agree with Ambassador Saran that, when it comes to geopolitics, a different kind of dynamic really does go into place. And that's true of this region as well. I want to make one more point. Ashley is absolutely right when he says that, India has become more difficult, more inward looking, more perhaps hyper-nationalist when it comes to the economic sphere. But, so has the United States. And I think we must take away from this possible discussion the idea that both India and the US really should see these as areas where they can actually lead the world together. Vaccines is a great example where despite everything, despite the fact that now people are questioning if it was a good policy or not, India shipped out 60 million vaccines to other countries in the world, including grants, commercial shipments, and that sort of thing. The US today still has not changed a law that actually bans any products for these vaccines being shipped out. In fact, the biggest Indian vaccine manufacturer wrote a letter earlier this month to his to people ordering from him and said, I'm really having trouble procuring these essential, kind of products that go into making vaccines or go into delivery because the US still has this ban on it. They spoke at the Quad Summit, for example, about the US funding capacity building of an Indian vaccine manufacturer to promote the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, probably for all of Southeast Asia. But there was a basic link that was missing. India is, along with South Africa, at the WTO today, asking that countries waive their intellectual property TRIPS, if you like, concerns just for the COVID-19 period. And that's something that the US still has not come on board with. These are all small areas where they can find a way to together lead the world, together show that they can actually get over what Ashley referred to as your own, sort of nationalistic instincts. And then just very quickly on that Myanmar point, I do want to point out that when it came to the events of just a few days ago, more than 100 protesters were killed on that one day. We saw military chiefs of about 8 countries, including the US, Australia, Japan, and some European countries, actually putting out a statement criticizing the Myanmar military for its role, whereas India was part of a very different group of 8 countries that actually took part in the Myanmar Army Day functions, along with Russia, China, Pakistan, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, and so forth. So I do think that there's a lot of ground to be covered over before we can actually talk about having the same values, having the same, going into partnerships with this idea of values. I do think that it is necessary to keep focused with each of the groupings that India and the US work together on, and perhaps to keep the biggest focus on the bilateral aspect of the India-US partnership itself.
Shyam, can I throw 2 audience questions to you? One is I'm hoping you can also pick up on the connectivity question, because you've served all around the, in posts all around the periphery. What can India do to intensify and foster connectivity to a greater degree? First within South Asia, but since Suhasini mentioned BIMSTEC, to the east as well, since that moves you toward Thailand and ASEAN. And then second, I think I know how you're going to answer this question, but there's a question from Saad Malik here that says, is India essentially moving toward polarity? And who's the pole that it's attracted to if it is moving toward polarity? And Ashley, you might want to jump on that one too.
Well, the good news is that connectivity in the region is completely accepted, that it is necessary. So that we should have cross-border connectivity across the whole of the subcontinent, nobody contests that position. The problem arises in what I call the software of connectivity. That is, it is not enough to have a train line across the border. It is not enough to have a very nice 4-lane highway across the border. If still your procedures are such that you have trucks, for example, standing at the border for 2 days or 3 days, or there is still a lot of, sort of bureaucratic red tape in people being able to move across. I think those are the sort of things that need to be addressed. Because there is somehow a feeling that as long as you build a road across the border, connectivity has been done. No, that is not the case. And here, what I would like to, remind people is that both the United States as well as Japan had actually come together with India to try and see what can be done together in terms of promoting connectivity within India's Northeast and across the border in the Northeast with some of the neighboring countries. That was actually an initiative taken by the three countries. I'm not quite sure why it did not go further than it should have, but there is a willingness to really look at what common interests we have in terms of taking this connectivity project forward, and particularly in respect to what I mentioned, are the security concerns that we have about cross-border movement because of the threat of terrorism or contraband moving across the border. Are there ways in which we can address those issues, not put them aside, but address those issues in ways that does not, in fact, defeat the very purpose of connectivity that we have? In fact, all across the world, these are issues which have been successfully addressed with, technology, high technology that is now available, which was not available 20 years ago. So there are actually very useful things that you can do together, which can promote the whole, objective of bringing about much greater connectivity in India. And I would say in this respect that I do not see, and I have contested this again and again, I do not see BIMSTEC as an alternative to SAR. You can do both. I see no reason why you should say no SAR, only BIMSTEC. No, it is not necessary. And I welcome the fact what Suhasini mentioned, that there seem to be some green shoots with respect to resuming economic and trade relations with Pakistan. Because ultimately, I think from India's point of view, having a much more integrated South Asia is fundamental. And this is why I think, if you go back to 2003, if I'm not mistaken, when Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee at the SAARC summit put out actually a very, very expansive vision. He said, why is it not possible for South Asian countries together to have a common currency, to have a kind of a customs union, even have a directly elected parliament? I think there was in that articulation a sense that really India's future, India's own destiny is very much interlinked with what happens in its neighborhood. So if we are saying neighborhood first policy, all that you need to do is to actually translate it in real terms on the ground. The policy is there. So neighborhood first, connectivity being important, it is not that these are not accepted by any political. We have had several political dispensations who have actually signed on to this. It's a question of how much are you really able to put it in place, and in that sense, working together with, say, countries like the US, Japan, or even Australia, and even others, in trying to see how actually we can translate that connectivity project on the ground could be very, very helpful.
Right. So we're actually past the top of the hour, so we've run over time. But I don't want to close it without just doing a lightning round where I ask you one last question. So we're talking about U.S.-India partnership in Asia. So if you're thinking on a one-year time horizon, each of you, what is the missing dimension that you wish the U.S. and India were doing together in the regional context but aren't? And how do we get from here to there in terms of maybe one or two practical steps that they could do? I'll just go in reverse order. So Ashley, what should the U.S. and India be doing in Asia that they're not doing?
Well, the single most important thing I think the US and India have to do is to set right their economic relationship. I mean, their bilateral economic relationship first, because if we don't get that right, everything else that we do with respect to economic cooperation with third parties will only end up being cosmetic. It's not that both sides don't want to do it. They want to do it. They've expressed that intention. They will do it, but it'll be superstructure. It'll be modest efforts at showing that the partnership works, even as the foundations are really threatened by our inability to arrive at an understanding about what kind of economic relationship we want among ourselves.
So we clear away the underbrush, or Kathy Tai goes and clears away the underbrush with Piyush Goyal, or we aim high and negotiate a bilateral investment treaty.
Oh, I think a bilateral investment treaty is something that we should be able to do in our sleep. The real challenge is actually creating
we haven't done that
a free trade agreement. I mean, the free trade agreement is something that I think is so way beyond the horizon because of impediments on both sides. But a bit, my God, I mean, if we can't bring ourselves to negotiate a bit, then there's no hope for us.
I used to say, we have a bit. The U.S. has a bit with Kyrgyzstan, but does not have a bit with India. But we're saying Shyam, top of your wish list for the U.S. and India.
Well, I would say that during this year, if we can get the climate change story right between India and the U.S., that would be a huge step forward, because my experience has been this is very fraught territory. Even though I think there are many things that India and in the US should be doing together, and the kind of rule making that you're talking about here too, I think there is opportunity, but lots of shall I say minefields that we have to cross. So if we can in this year, if the two sides can sit down together and work out their climate change story together, that will be a huge step forward, and it would have a very good impact on other aspects of the relationship. Because I feel that if you do not really engage on this and really get that right, this could become another vulnerability in the relationship.
And that means they coordinate and show up in Glasgow with common or coordinated commitments?
On some issues.
That's
not
really in a multilateral context.
But at least in some key issues, if they can have a sort of a basically aligned position. I'm not looking at, across the board. That's not going to be possible. Okay. But if it's in terms of the larger narrative, if there can be some alignment between the two sides, I think that would be a huge step forward.
Okay. So Suhasini, the last word goes to, so we've got economics, we've got climate and environment on the demand and potentially on the supply side. So now I'm hoping you're going to go to geostrategy, or you're going to go to values, or just to complement these two guys. But top of your wish list.
Values is like a minefield. I wouldn't go into it, but I'm sure we'll hear more on the climate change conversation when Mr. John Kerry visits Delhi in the next couple of weeks ahead of the climate summit planned by President Biden, where I think the US and India can work together is by providing, and this is something I spoke about earlier, providing that transparent, sustainable, environmentally friendly, standard-based alternative to so many countries in this region that are really looking to grow, are really looking for infrastructure, but just don't have the means to do it without making it about a choice between one side or the other. I think if India and the US can genuinely work towards that, even if they work towards different parts of the region, they will make a huge difference to the way a society sees growth, the way society sees development as well. It doesn't have to be in the manner that we have seen, the haphazard kind of development we've seen over the last couple of decades, and instead be sustainable, be eco-friendly, be conscious of local needs and local cultures. I do think they can set the course forward. And while I will not speak about values, I will say that only two democracies can together provide that kind of alternative.
All right. Well, all three of you have offered a nice charge to the two governments. I happen to think it's an ambitious one, Ashley, notwithstanding. But it ought to be a low bar, but it always seems to be a high bar.
It's more ambitious.
We seem to clear it.
Then simply doing, maritime exercises together, exactly. Joint exercises. It's certainly more ambitious than that.
So the good news, as Shyam told us, is that over these many years, Americans and Indians seem to find a way to clear these bars together, and we've come a long way. And the Asian context is changing, and so it's an important part of our strategic and economic geography. I've learned it too.
For one last word, that when we are talking about Asia, if we can begin the process of defining Asia somewhat broader than just East Asia, that itself would be a big step forward. That is why I said that, talking about CENTCOM, talking about Africa Command was, to me, something important, because it seemed to indicate that there is a slight shift in terms of looking at what could be actually the extent and scope of the partnership.
Well, you're preaching to the choir on this, and I should say that at the Carnegie Endowment, we now treat East Asia, South Asia in a much more organic and integrated way, which is why Carnegie India, Carnegie Tsinghua Center, the Washington-based South Asia program, our Washington-based Asia program, and our Russia in Asia program that we have at our Carnegie Moscow Center. We do collaborate, we think, in a somewhat integrated way about the region, and I think that reflects the change in the region itself as well as in our own thinking about it. Anyway, I've learned a ton. I hope the audience has too. It's always a privilege to see the three of you and to do this with you. So I want to thank you on behalf of Carnegie for doing it, and wish you a very good day, but we're very grateful to do it. And I apologize again to the audience for our early technical difficulties, but I see from the audience numbers you stuck with it, and I hope you're glad you did. I certainly am. Thank you, everyone, and thanks, gang, for joining us. Thank you.